Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. This is the second and final episode of the series titled Hegel, Marx, and Sustainable Development, a study in Incompatible. Now, in previous podcast, we talked about Hegel to lay a groundwork to a central problem, that is to say, to explicate why Marx and Marxism, by extension, is not really applicable to sustainable development, and that those critics, relatively rare critics of sustainable development, mostly in the West, are wrong when they consider sustainable development to be some kind of neo-Marxism. But before we dive into the crux of this problem, that is to say, Marx's own philosophical assumptions that are completely out of sync or out of tune with sustainable development, let us say a few words about sustainable development itself. What is the sustainable development? Well, as I mentioned in a previous episode, sustainable development is a method of standardization of the systems. This is the most simple definition I can give, and out of it we can draw some implications and conclusions. So, sustainable development works on assumption that there are free systems that comprise more or less everything that exists. So those are systems of society, economy, and environment. And those three systems have to be in balance. This balance is a dynamical balance. This means that sustainable development is a form of politics, but also a form of ontology, because ambition of the sustainable development theory is to explain everything, or better to say, to reduce everything that is on these three systems. And what many people fail to see when they encounter sustainable development is the fact that among those three systems there is no hierarchy. That is to say, not one of them is preeminent over others or has greater intrinsic value. Most people, when they encounter this theory and this politics, believe that is some kind of humanism in which environment and economy, for instance, have to be cut to size if they start to interfere with human lives. If, for instance, if pollution is starting to make life difficult for masses of humanity, and so on and so forth. Nothing can be further from the truth. And this is something that has to be understood. If this were true, then there would maybe be some kind of mutual ground for sustainable development and Marxism, for instance, or some other form of 19th or early 20th century political theory. But this is not the case. In sustainable development, all three systems are intrinsically equal. And what is the main purpose of the sustainable politics is to keep them equal. I will give you an example. If you take, for instance, some kind of human settlement or human population in some place on earth that is burning a lot of wood, using wood as a fuel, and after some time creates deforestation of some region. Sustainable policy would be to cut this human population or human group to size in various ways. Now I won't assume what method would be applied, but what is important, this is not done because destruction of forest is putting in danger other groups or human race in general, as most people think when they think about ecology, and most of what today passes for ecology or green politics is sustainable development. In fact, this has to be done for the sake of trees. All three systems have equal rights, and I say word rights advisedly because there is a very strong legal dimension to sustainable development, a kind of system-based legislation which regulates it, and which is by design blind to qualitative differences. When I say blind to qualitative differences, I think it's obvious what this means, because you have to be blind as if not to see that trees cannot have rights. This is not something to joke about, because sustainable development is based on this. This is the ontology in which human does not compute. And also word compute I use advisedly, because the basis of sustainable development does not lie in philosophy as philosophy was understood in 19th century when Marx was developing his political ontology, or Hegel before him. But it is its real birthplace is world of natural sciences, the sphere of natural sciences, to be more precise, of top-level engineering, and the first computers and first computer models, and the systems about which sustainable development, around which sustainable development is being developed, computational systems, systems that are not that have nothing in common with what Hegel or Marx would call system. So the example of wood and the right of the tree or trees is, I think, something that can put us in position to finally compare sustainable development to original Marxian ontology. I always stress this word ontology because I'm not talking about Marxism as politics, but Marx's fundamental assumptions. Now, curiously enough, expression sustainable development comes from forestry, from the specific method of forestry or managing forests that was developed in 18th century Germany. The original word is nachhaltige Entwicklung. And the thing I want to talk about, considering Marx, is precisely the issue of forests, woods, cutting of trees, and relationship of man and the tree. In 1842, Marx wrote a series of articles entitled Debates on the Laws on the Theft of Woods. Those articles were commentaries on the debates about the expansion of the notion of criminality from stealing the woods from the private forests, in the sense, for instance, of people chopping someone else's wood, or someone else felling someone else's trees, to pilfering of wood. That means merely people picking up, poor people picking up dry branches that fell off the trees, and so forth, so on and so forth. So one of those German regional councils at that time tried to criminalize this pilfering of woods, because they have seen it as a theft of private property, but they of course had trouble to define what is criminal about it. Now, Marx's argument is very convoluted. when we come to this subject, and this is, I admit, rather obscure, but it's very good to understanding his philosophical, or better to say ontological, suppositions. Moreover, because it's the whole debate is about nature and the relationship of man and nature. Now, before we dive into this, let's remember what Hegel has in mind concerning relation of conscious subject or human being and nature and world in general. Now, all things in the world, all non-human things, be it animals, be it other parts of nature, gain their meaning and purpose in the fullest sense of the word, becoming things in the proper sense of the word only by the action that consciousness performs on them. This action, in the widest sense of the word, is something that Hegel calls labor of negative. Now, in Hegel's case, labor of negative in its absolute and most perfect form is contemplation, a special kind of contemplation as Hegel envisioned it, working partly on assumption of the traditional metaphysics, but giving his own spin that kind of like completely cuts itself from the source, of the said traditional metaphysics. That's of course something that would be too much of digression to explain here. So let us just try to give a framework of what it means. The first action of the consciousness towards the world is adjusting the world to itself. Because, as we have said in previous podcast, the previous episode, that is, the whole purpose of the existence is the Versöhnung, of reconciliation between subject or consciousness and object, of subject seeing himself in the object. Something that is also called abolition or absolute Aufhebung, overcoming of the Entfremdung, alienation. Why is this a negative act? Well, because every act of consciousness is changing what is given. And the first act of consciousness, where consciousness really affirms itself as such, is work, as we said in previous podcast while talking about master-slave dialectics. Marx gives this a different spin, claiming that work, in fact, is the absolutely the whole of this negative act of liberation, in fact, of liberating human being from the world, in a sense, making world his own. And in this sense, for instance, when we think about trees and woods, now going back to our example from Rheinische Zeitung of mid-19th century, the wood has its purpose as a mean to an end. It can never be above man, above human being, and above consciousness that works on it, because its value and its meaning is something that is not given by its own intrinsic subsistent nature, but by its relation to human needs. Things are needful things. Things are needs. Things exist to fulfill human needs. Because in Hegel, the whole purpose of the existence of the world is the advent of consciousness and revelation of spirit, in the sense of creating the world of society, history, of later of art, of religion, of philosophy, everything that is under this, under these things that come, these realities that come through human acts, in Hegel's view, is absolutely lower, absolutely below on the hierarchy of existence. Marx gives this other spin. As I said, he sees political and economical realities as really the only true sphere in which the humanity, not anymore absolute spirit as in Hegel, which is in a curious ways for Hegel both human and above human. In Marx, it is not about, nothing is about above human, least of all trees. Now note, I was talking about sustainable development and rights of trees. You can already see that Karl Marx would not be happy with an idea that trees have rights. And as a matter of fact, he said something to that effect. Namely, in these laws, expansion of criminality to the filtering of wood, Marx saw in this complete and utter alienation that happens to human beings because of unjust, that is not unjust, but unequal social relations that are inherent to modern civil society. Now, civil society is has very strict meaning in Hegelian terms, which Marx uses. It's not what we today consider civil society to be, not at least not entirely. For Marx, civil society is that sphere of society that is proper to individual needs and his own existence as apart from political community, because political community is kind of like opposite, at least at first sight. That is to say, this is the aspect of society where everybody is involved in something greater than himself, where everybody is obliged to make decisions, to think about collective, communal issues, and not only about his own family, business, and so on and so forth. Now, civil society in Hegel is a principle of individuation, in the sense that in civil society man is realized as an individual, and the bedrock of this individuation is private property. Because in private property we make things as conscious subjects, we make things that are not conscious subjects, that are objects opposite of us, ours. We claim them in a sense. By making them ours, we reduce our alienation from them. And Marx believed that this was hardly the case. Because in example of this pilfering of woods that was criminalized as a theft of wood, he said that the only way the legislator was able to pull that off is to give tree and forest a kind of like subsistent existence, so that trees were turned into some kind of forest gods, people who are poor but who are human, therefore infinitely more valuable than any conceivable tree, have to bow to the trees as if before gods. And any kind of theft of wood and even pilfering of the fallen off branches would be angering the tree gods. Now, how this comes about? Well, Marx believed that economical relation that are brought about by the civil society of his age, by bourgeoisie, and the means of its economical reproduction of its own social existence, turn everything into commodity or goods, Ware in German. Once what Marx considers interesting here, and not a little insidious, is that in this way the non-human things become, in a sense, perceived as suprahuman things. They become, as he would say, Götzen, that is to say, idols or fetishes. And this is what there's his famous phrase, fetishization of the merchandise or fetishization of the goods. What this means? when Marx says that religion is opium of the people, or that every critic must begin with critique of religion, he said something very specific in mind. For Marx, religion is Hegelian philosophy, in a word. He and most of his contemporaries considered Hegelian philosophy as the utmost in theology, in fact, because in Hegel, truth be told, philosophy and theology are identical in his peculiar philosophication of Lutheran Protestantism. This is something very peculiar for Germany and for German philosophers of that age. And for some reason, years, decades, and even 100 years after Hegel, a lot of intellectuals considered this to be a kind of like interpretation of religion that has universal value. No, it is extremely conditioned by local culture. It's extremely localized in Germany, and as its source in German understanding of Protestant religion and historical moment. Now, what's wrong with this in Karl Marx's opinion? Well, simple. Religion is for Marx a projection of the unjust or unequal, let us not forget, I use this word unequal advisably because it's very important not to mix up real notion of justice with notion of equality. Those relationships are projected in the world as it is, as such, and this way distort the way the people perceive the world. So as everything is valued only as property, because civil society, in the sense of this Bürgertum of individual people who are trying to maximize their private property, is in complete discrepancy with political community. It is alienated. Those two poles that Hegel considered to be reconciled in the series of mediation, of Vermittlungen, Marx sees as something that is in complete discrepancy. And the result is that these relations are projected in the world. So by imagining the tree to be nothing but commodity, we are doing, in Marx's view, the human beings, are doing the same thing as some, I don't know, native totemistic religious did to animals or plants and so on. Deified them. Marx considered this process to be to have same basis. So when he says religion, this is what he means by religion. Everything is a product of conscious subject, because philosophical assumption from which Marx works is subject-object split as understood in classical German philosophy. We said something about that in first episode when talking about Hegel. And this is what we get, says Marx. Well, this is something that should be abolished. And by the way, this is what Marx considers ideology to be. This is more or less his definition of ideology. And he considered one of the perfect abstract ideologies, perfect in the same sense of its logical consistence, but unrelatedness to reality, German philosophy, notably Hegel's and some other Hegelians after Hegel, sometimes former Marxist colleagues and friends, never mind. Anyway, this is ideology and religion. There could be put the sign of equality. So there is nothing substantially different between, for instance, believing in Eucharist, on real existence of Christ in the host, and for instance this kind of commodification of the tree, in which, as we all worship money, because private property is all we know about as a value, we start worshipping tree as a commodity. So this is, of course, I will not enter into criticism now.
it makes no sense to take us too far. But I want to point out how is this incompatible with sustainable development. Namely, what Marx says here is that by worshipping nature, in a sense, through commodifying it, we are in fact going at even more destructive level than some kind of primitive people that are worshipping forces of nature, personalizing them. Commodification does the same thing, because a tree as a commodity has a self-subsistence. People who are pilfering woods will understand that they are doing something illegal not by reading laws, but understanding the tree as something that they must not hurt, because those branches are parts of this commodity that belongs to somebody else. And what Marx wanted is that people realize that those are illusions, and so forth, so on and so forth. I have to say, his argumentation is extremely convoluted. To go into criticism of Marxism would really go too far now, but I want you just, I'm a bit digressing in back and forth from Marx, sustainable development, subject at hand, to this classical German philosophy, in order for you to see that some things that we consider universal in the intellectual sphere, in philosophy and so on, are not so. They are very localized. The problems from which Marx worked, the ideas he inverted, because most of that philosophy, ontology, because it's anti-philosophy, Marx wants to abolish, in fact, the contemplative approach to the world. But he understands it as Hegelian contemplation, and Hegelian contemplation has very little to do, save in words, with what Aristotle considered contemplation to be, or Thomas Aquinas or somebody else. To see that this is very localized, this is, I think, very good mental footnote for you to think about. This is a German thing. This is a historical thing from a very specific time in history that performed influence further, to say the least. But that influence was later transformed into some completely unrecognizable forms of these original ideas. But these ideas are not universal. This is not Marx's criticism of religion, for instance. He's a genuine atheist, mind you, but this is atheism that is has very concrete target, and that target is not easy to reconcile with other possible targets for Marxism, as Catholic, for instance, the transcendental philosophy of Middle Age or something like that. Hegel himself, who deemed himself religious, would never accept those teachings, those doctrines, because modernity in general doesn't really jive with them. But these German philosophers were, in fact, very much divorced, on the one hand, from tradition. On the other hand, they used a kind of empty framework of tradition, logical framework, to give expression to their thoughts. Anyway, to conclude, now I already point out few things that can demonstrate to you that Marxist, or Marx, even this original Marx suppositions, are completely out of sync, so to speak, with sustainable development. First of all, there is a clear hierarchy. Marxism is extreme humanism. So as much as humanism can be despicable for somebody, especially for somebody who is genuinely religious, because humanism is an extremely insidious stance, sustainable development is not humanism. In sustainable development, hierarchy does not exist. The reason why in this modern ecological movements, Greta Thunberg, figures like Greta Thunberg as such, in various forms of sustainable development advocacy that advocate for control and decrease of population, for practically for reducing the number of human beings on Earth. The reason why this is done is not because humans are very important in sustainable development mentality, but because humans were very long time in the center of the hierarchy of being, before God was at the center. But now human has to be reduced to size, and this is something that sustainable development by its very mechanisms, its intrinsic drive does. That's why this happens. But all free systems comprising of economy, of goods, societal institution, and things like forests and herds of animals and so on are completely equal. There is no hierarchy. This is something that is completely incomparable. Now, if Marxist methods are used, not Marxist, socialist methods, let's say, because socialism is a teaching according to which human being is ultimately formed by outside influence, by society at large, from the outside, not from the inside. This is the main supposition of socialism. Everything else, social justice and such things, and in fact it's not social justice, it's equalization, equality, come afterwards. So you have justice in liberalism also, but liberalism doesn't work on this assumption that much. This is strictly socialist assumption. Those methods and those aspects can be present in sustainable development, but the core principles are important. And I'm sorry to say that from all the critics I see of sustainable development in the West, at least from what I can see, they fall in this trap of not trying to figure out these assumptions. And so they go into tirades of sustainable development on some kind of neo-Marxism and so forth, whereas this is completely wrong. The other reason also is, I'm afraid, that most of the Western critics don't want to realize and don't want to face the fact that sustainable development and similar postmodern political ontology of extremely destructive and totalitarian, absolutely intrinsically totalitarian bent, are in fact product of their own modern traditions, if something modern can be called a tradition. So they have more to do with natural sciences, seeking their own ontology, because natural sciences kind of work on assumption that doesn't work, in fact, that they don't need metaphysics, they don't need ontology, they are free of value judgments and so on and so forth, but the hell they are. This is one way to create ontology from physics, chemistry and computer science, and ultimately from engineering approach to the world, technical approach to the world. This is not Marxism. This is much closer to traditions, political and economical traditions existing in USA, for instance, in Western Europe and so forth. I don't think most of conservative or critics of any bent trying to criticize sustainable development, especially in America, I think they simply don't want to see this, which is, I guess, understandable, but not forgivable. So let's say this was in short a summation of the problem of sustainable development and its surprising originality. What I wanted to point out was simply that when you encounter criticism of sustainable development, that tries to connect it to these philosophical traditions, a history of philosophy, or those ideological movements, or better to say, I'm sorry, absolute political movements, political theories of fascism or communism. It has very little to do with them. It has much more to do with that, under which we live now, as its logical consequence. It would be going too far for me to make a conclusion that, I don't know, that sustainable development is the last word of liberalism. I don't think it is. I don't think that liberalism is intrinsically totalitarian by itself, but it can become totalitarian. But in becoming totalitarian, it erases itself. That happens with ideology, but it is a political ontology. That is to say, it has this intrinsic drive as a modern political ontology. I call it political ontology because I don't like word ideology. It's much used, but I prefer to understand it as Marx understood it, because today very often unconsciously it is in fact used in Marxian sense. I don't like Marxian sense. I don't think it's workable. I call it ontology. Political ontology is a political idea that takes into consideration whole of being, entirety of being, and kind of like from this it derives conclusions that motivate political action. That's political ontology. So sustainable development, in conclusion, is a political ontology that is not based on Marxism and on other thinkers like Hegel, upon which Marx and Marxism have been based. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune.